Hello, and welcome to Behind the Music, where we take an inside look at the music you'll hear on North Carolina Symphony programs. I'm Joseph Peters, Associate Principal Oboe and English Horn with the Symphony, and this weekend we will perform a program featuring two great Romantic symphonies, Schumann's Fourth and Tchaikovsky's Sixth. These are each composer's final symphonies. Both of them are a bit unusual, innovative for their time, emotionally complex, and deeply rooted in each composer's romanticism. Robert Schumann wrote in the early part of the Romantic period, but deeply embraced its principles. He was greatly interested in portraying and exploring emotion, the supernatural, dreams, memories, all kinds of intense and passionate human emotion that defined much of the Romantic period. That's all here in this piece, but it's most notable for its unique form and an inventiveness that still sounds fresh and a bit wild to our modern ears. This was actually the second symphony that Schumann wrote. He composed his first symphony, Spring, over the course of a few days in 1841 and began work on this very different piece in D minor just a few months later. It was premiered to a mixed reception and was not immediately published because Schumann's publisher didn't want it to compete with sales of his more popular First Symphony, so it sat around for about 10 years when it was then published as his Symphony No. 4. His First Symphony had been fairly sunny and conventional, and Schumann wanted this new D minor symphony to be unorthodox, challenging, and much darker and more intense. He had spent the previous year composing some of the great art songs for which he's most famous, including the song cycles Dichterliebe and Liederkreis, and so one might expect him to bring this melodic gift to his symphonic writing as well. And he does, but mostly here Schumann writes like a true symphonist. He uses shorter motives rather than long, sweeping melodies and really develops them, working through different keys and presenting them in different ways, much like Beethoven would do before him. This focus on developing and repeating motives is crucial in this piece because of its unusual form. It is a symphony written without any pauses. Each movement flows directly into the next, and Schumann often repeats the same motives in multiple movements. This is called cyclic form, and it creates, as you might imagine, a wonderful continuity and unity across what would otherwise be a sprawling symphony. The first movement begins with a winding, slow introduction and then transitions to a faster main section. It's turbulent and intense, and that's a quality that persists throughout this entire symphony. Schumann immediately begins developing this frantic little melody, working it through different keys and repetitions. There's a lot of energy and inertia in this opening section. The middle of the movement introduces a few new tunes, a more heroic march-like theme in the winds, and a lovely lyrical tune in the strings. The frenetic energy persists, though, right to the end of the movement, which then dives directly into the next. In the second movement, we hear Schumann's gift for melody in the opening tune in the oboe and cello. This tune frames the movement. We hear it again at the end, but in the middle, Schumann gives us a beautiful melody in the solo violin and also brings back music from the first movement, our first example of the cyclic structure that ties the work together. The third movement is a rough scherzo, sort of a wild dance, but again, Schumann reuses his melodies by bringing back the gentle violin tune from the previous movement. The excitement of the scherzo winds down to a magical passage that gradually and solemnly builds and builds until erupting into the final movement. This is the payoff for Schumann's meticulous thematic repetition. The main theme of the last movement is actually a combination of tunes from the first movement, now in a major key, tying the whole piece together back to front. The finale is exciting and joyful, but it's most effective because it exists as a culmination of all that has come before, an inexorable flow through four intense movements connected by shared themes and a deep, passionate romanticism. Next, we come to Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky's Sixth Symphony, a great masterpiece that has been shrouded in mystery for its entire existence, partly by the circumstances surrounding its premiere and partly by the intent of the composer. Tchaikovsky knew he wanted to create a passionate, career-capping work with a secret, hidden program, a symphony that would be innovative and shocking. He actually set out sketching a different work, the Symphony in E flat, which he eventually scrapped. But he wrote this about his basic outline plan for the piece, quote, "The ultimate essence of the symphony is life. First movement, all passion, confidence, thirst for life. Second movement, love. The third, disappointment. The fourth ends dying away." Now, Tchaikovsky gave up on the Symphony in E flat while he was in the process of orchestrating it, but this general plan lived on in the Sixth Symphony. He wrote the following to his nephew. He said, "I had the idea for another symphony, this time with a program, but such a program that will remain an enigma to everyone. Let them guess. The program itself will be suffused with subjectivity, and not infrequently during my travels while composing it in my head, I wept a great deal. The form of this symphony will have much that is new, and amongst other things, the finale will not be a noisy allegro, but on the contrary, a long, drawn-out adagio." Of course, Tchaikovsky achieved all of this with the Sixth Symphony. We will never know exactly what program Tchaikovsky had intended for the music, and the music is deeply impassioned, very personal and dramatic, much like Tchaikovsky himself. From the first bars, it is brooding, with a bassoon growling out a tragic melody built on a simple scale. Like much of Tchaikovsky's music, this entire work centers around the simple motion of ascending and descending scales. And I don't mean this to be a mundane analysis. Of course, most music contains scales in some way, but Tchaikovsky had a particular way of using a scale to great emotional and dramatic effect. Each movement's melodies are either clearly built around a scale or, like the third movement, use scales for thrilling embellishment around the tune. It's something to hang your ear on as you listen to this great piece and many other works of Tchaikovsky. The rest of the first movement is turbulent, aside from a brief, passionate melody, one of Tchaikovsky's most famous, again built on a sighing, descending scale. The second movement is a waltz, but it's in 5/4 time, so while you couldn't dance to it, the little jolt of the missing beat gives it a certain unease and forward drive that undercuts the otherwise very loving melody, built, again, around ascending scales. The third movement is a wild march. It begins as a flutter of quiet activity with the jaunty melody ornamented at every turn by flurries of scales and culminating in a very Tchaikovskyan finale with the movement's built-up tension exploding out in a series of course, scales, this time led by the brass. That this is not, in fact, the final movement is one of the things that lends this piece some of its mystery. The fourth movement that follows is a tragic lament that covers everything that came before it in shadow. The loving waltz now seems a bit more uneasy, more anxious. The waltz now seems like an artificial joy, a false happy ending. The theme of this last movement is, once more, a scale, but it's divided between the two violin sections and they play alternating notes of this tune. This prevents this simple scale from sounding easy. The act of handing the tune between the sections creates tension and makes it more labored. It's a brilliant touch of orchestration. The movement builds to a passionate climax, but ultimately fades to nothing, a thoroughly enigmatic ending, just as Tchaikovsky intended. Unfortunately for everyone, Tchaikovsky died just a few days after the premiere of the symphony, and historians subsequently went really wide with this, clouding the work in another layer of mystery. It's generally accepted that Tchaikovsky died of cholera. There was an epidemic in St. Petersburg at the time, and he was treated by numerous doctors, and his final days are well documented. Still, there persists a rumor that Tchaikovsky died by suicide, supposedly for some shame or torment about his homosexuality, and that this symphony was his suicide note. Now, Tchaikovsky was certainly a bit of a tortured soul, but he was widely known to be gay at the time, and though he struggled with it as a young man, he was actually out to both of his brothers, one of whom, Modest, was also gay himself. He certainly would face no repercussions in the court of the Tsar, who had granted him numerous awards, and he seems to have accepted his sexuality, even writing, following his disastrous marriage, quote, "Only now, especially after the tale of my marriage, have I finally begun to understand that there is nothing more fruitless than not wanting to be that which I am by nature." So, not only was this symphony likely not a suicide note, he was quite proud of it and knew he had created something remarkable despite what the public might think at first, writing, quote, "To me, it would be typical and unsurprising if this symphony were torn to pieces or little appreciated, for it wouldn't be the first time that had happened. But I absolutely consider it to be the best, and in particular, the most sincere of all my creations. I love it as I have never loved any of my other musical offspring. I think it will be successful. It is rare for me to write anything with such love and enthrallment." The idea that Tchaikovsky, or anyone for that matter, could not be both happy and gay is a trope endlessly projected on Tchaikovsky throughout history, but it does not seem to have been the cause of either his death or the genesis of the symphony. So we're left with the music itself and its hidden program for each of us to imagine for ourselves. If symphonies are a preserve for endangered emotions, as one of my great mentors put it, then this is a particularly rich and layered emotional landscape, which we look forward to sharing with you this week. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of the works of Schumann and Tchaikovsky that you'll hear on this weekend's program, and we hope to see you in the concert hall.